Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited for this episode. We've got Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier on, who is a founder of the Lair House. It's a really cool website if you haven't seen it. He just finished his PhD this year at Yale University, and for the past year taught at Yeshiva College and Yale Divinity School. And then this coming year, he will be a postdoctoral candidate at McGill University. Do they have a mascot?
I need to check that, actually. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it'll be your new place for a year. Root for the, I don't know if they have Canadian football or whatever up there, but awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Absolutely. So it may seem totally irrelevant to everything or anything, yet within the broad spectrum of actually Jewish drinking, it curiously is kind of relevant because it comes up even in Jewish life today, as even though we don't practice it, yet it comes up on our prayers in Shabbat, holidays, timely events. The funny backstory for everybody out there is that libations actually occurred to me as a Jewish drinking topic when I was doing, for the 17 weeks that I was doing the Parsha sheets, and I was looking for drinking the Parsha, and I said, you know what, I'll count libations. It's some sort of beverage. And so I put it in and I started wondering, wait, what's the deal with libations? Like, what's this all about? I've never, ever paid it. And probably like most Jews, what about you? You probably also ignored it, right?
Most people, actually, I have an article or two about libations, and I actually started off by saying most people pay no attention to libations. But once you do pay attention, there's a lot of really cool stuff. If you think about it, Judaism believes in emulating God's ways. And if one thinks of the wine libations as sort of offering the wine to God, and God, as it were, drinking it, or maybe not, we'll look into that a bit. It's the model. It's maybe emulating God in some way.
That's a good appetizer. That's a good appetizer for this conversation. We'll get into the meat of things soon.
That's right.
All right, let the puns fly. When you get rabbis together, puns fly. So libations are an obscure topic, and so Rabbi Dr. Zuckier here completed his dissertation this year on offerings, right, and temple offerings, and libations as an aspect. I thought to reach out to him, so here he is. In Genesis, it appears once. We see Jacob offering in chapter 35. It's really, by the way, it's unclear what he libates with. And so you get a couple of commentators suggesting maybe it's wine as a possibility, maybe something else. Unclear. He libates it at I think it's at a matzeva, like the standing pillar thing. Curiously, it's not offered with anything else, right? It's just a standalone.
It sounds right. He has the nesech and shemen and oil as well. But right, both of those are usually secondary offerings, come along with a meat offering.
Right, but there's no meat off. Jacob doesn't offer anything. It's just
here they come alone. Yeah,
it's just liquids at that matzeva. But then in the rest of the Torah, we see some other stuff. So there's nothing in Deuteronomy, but then we see a little bit in Exodus, a little bit in Leviticus, and then a really whole bunch in the book of Numbers. So we do have these daily libations that occur as part of the morning and evening offerings in Exodus chapter 29. And then Numbers, we really get the bulk of it in chapters 15, 28, 29, where we get not only the daily stuff, but all the really special occasions. And that's really where most of the libation happens. One of the curious things I find really super duper fascinating is that most of it is like by time. So every day has it, twice a day. Shabbat gets a little bit extra. And then we see some holidays, which I'll mention in a moment, what gets what. But the only time related one is for the Nazir. So this Nazirite, for lack of a better translation. So he's this guy. Could it be a gal?
Yeah. This is actually an explicit verse. It says a man or a woman if they want to become a Nazir. So it's a great trick question, because most people would say, well, of course, women can't become Nazirites in Judaism, but it's an explicit verse, so it's always good. It's a good parlor trick to pull out.
There we go. It's a good Kiddush Club trivia piece.
That's right.
Or Kiddush trivia. You don't even have to go to the Kiddush Club, just Kiddush. So
maybe that can be the test to see whether you get into the club or not.
Ooh, that's a good one. So whether you're a Nazir or Nazirah, when you're done, you bring your offerings, you then drink. There's two components. Wine pops up not only as the Nazir's offering, but then after he offers it, he then drinks wine. Now, I know in the rabbinic literature, they actually specify he has the possibility to then drink wine.
He's permitted
it's not that he necessarily then drinks wine.
Right.
But according to the biblical verses, he drinks wine after he brings this offering, right?
I guess it depends on how you read it, right? Because one of the prohibitions of the Nazirite is not drinking wine. So you could see it as sort of the end, or maybe you marks the end precisely by having a drink.
It's almost like Havdalah, right? It's a ritual performance of closing it off and saying, look, I've not been able to drink wine this entire time, and now is my time. It's part of the return to normal life, because wine is part of normal life, and that's what's strange about a Nazir. It's not normal.
Right.
Drinking is part of life, right?
Right, and especially, I would say, especially in the pre-modern world where, it was difficult to get clean water in many places, and wine was, because it fermented, it can't get you sick and whatever. So that's at least part of the reason why wine was a staple of pre-modern diets.
Yeah, and it's a real surprise that this is actually the first time we've discussed Nazir here on the JewishRing.com podcast.
Really?
Maybe, yeah, it's a shocker, but maybe a topic of an entirely separate podcast conversation. Then we have all these different occurrences, various times of the year. So specifically, the daily offerings and Shabbat offerings each have a sheep or so. Now, we do see that there's a couple places where it specifies the correspondence, and basically I'm going to say two things. One is mostly the wine pouring out, the libating, the volume of the wine corresponds to the volume of the animal's meat being offered. So there's a quarter hin for every sheep offered, a third of a hin for every ram offered, and a half hin for every cattle offered. There is a curious piece, which is that goats seem to be offered and require a libation with a lot of the special daytime stuff, like the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. All these include a goat and also goat libation, but nothing is specified there. Do you have?
Right. So, generally, goats are assumed to be about the same size as a sheep. There's like three different sizes there's really like a range for sacrifices. You have like bulls, which are the biggest, then rams, then sheep. Those are your big animals. And then you have birds and flower offerings. And that's so presumably goats are with sheep in terms of size and also in terms of libations. Also, what's interesting is there's often things that have libations also have a flower offering, have a mincha, and and the mincha will have oil. You mix the flour with oil, and you have it ends up being like a sort of deep fried or a really tasty
cake
thing.
or a donut.
A donut, exactly.
Yeah.
And the amount of wine in the libation is equivalent usually to the amount of oil in the flour offering. So there's that correlation too. So the bigger the animal, the bigger the flour, the meal offering that accompanies it, and the bigger the libation. And as it gets smaller, you have less, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Big meals have big sides.
Right. The volume always corresponds with each other compared to the meats. And I think it's fitting at this time. You introduced me to Dr. Meshel's book, where this idea of basically a combo meal, that anybody who sees advertisements for restaurants offering combo meals, it doesn't consist of fries and a drink. There's the meat component, and then you have the fries and the drink. And similarly here, we've got a combo meal where we have the meat, and then we have the starch, this like cake-like thing, this doughy cake, and then we also have wine.
Right. Yeah. Actually, Dr. Meshel's a teacher of mine, a beloved teacher of mine, and it's really fascinating. Before I read it in the book, I actually studied it in a class with him, and you get the sense of, instead of this just being a collection of random details, there's a pattern here. The pattern is, and it's said explicitly, unclear how to interpret it, but God, God says, my meat, my food, my offering in Numbers 28. And the sacrifices are presented as God's food. He eats them in his house. Yeah. And there's a table and there's a candelabra, and so there's this model of God living in the temple and eating the food, at least, and dwelling there. What you do with that theologically is a different question, but that's what the biblical text says, and the model for the food makes a lot of sense too, right? God is offered as food meat sacrifices, and along with the meat you have, right, as you said, you have a starch side and you have a drink. And it really fits exactly with the combo meal. And I think there's Professor Meshel's book goes into some detail about how exactly the things can line up, like which animal offerings can fit with each other, and how you combine them with other sub offerings. And as you were saying, like you can't combine anything. You can't say like, okay, I won't have the Happy Meal. I'll just have the fries and the soda, right? That doesn't work. You need to have, there are certain rules, and he has a whole book that gives all those rules. It's really, really cool study.
That's really great. So now we got the sort of the building blocks, the components to this, And that's fascinating to me is like the daily offerings, it's just a sheep. So you really just get like a quarter hin of wine in the morning. By the way, when we talk about hin, how much volume, what quantity are we discussing?
A hin, I think I saw, I've never done these things myself, but a hin, as far as I understand, is about 1.5 gallons.
A gallon and a half.
So
okay.
it's a fair amount. A quarter for a sheep, you have a quarter of a hin, which is almost 0.4 gallons. And almost a bit under 0.5 gallon, and that's the amount of wine that you libate along with your sheep. I mean, sheep's not too small either, right? So you'd want something of significant size. But yeah.
For viewers and listeners of JewishRain.com, that's a lot of wine to be pouring out. That's a real sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's just on a daily basis, both in the morning and the evening, and then we get a little bit more going on for Shabbat. And then here we go, folks. This is where it gets really exciting. So for most of the other special days of the year, so with new moons, Rosh Hashanah, we get Passover, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and also Shemini Atzer. All of them are 3 1/12 hin plus whatever the goat's libation is. So if we want to toss in the goat's libation, which is an extra quarter hin, we'll get a little bit more, right? So that's a lot. That's a significant increase. We go from,
and as you said before, right?
We go from a quarter hin to 3 and more than a quarter hin. It's a massive dumping of wine.
And as you were saying before, it correlates to the size and number of the offerings, right? So yes. on the holiday of Sukkot, there are these many bulls that are brought along with other things. Yeah.
So right. So then those are all the regular holidays. But then we get to, as Rabbi Dr. Zuckier just said, then we get to Sukkot, when then it's a bonanza, right? So we have how many get offered? It's a lot.
So it's sort of a funny count. You start with 13 on the first day of Sukkot and count down to 7 on the 7th day, and then on the 8th day you have 1. It's a funny symbolism, and Chazal, the rabbis, suggest that it adds up to 70 for the 7 days, and that corresponds to the 70 nations of the world. And then on the 8th day, it's 1 corresponding to Israel, and that's supposed to indicate that God has a certain relationship with the entire world and a special, unique relationship with Israel.
Yeah. So that's all the animals. There's a lot of bulls, and they each get a half hin each. But what's really I counted it up. There are 10 2/3 hin of wine offered on the very first day, and then each subsequent day it decreases a half hin every day until the 7th day, when 7 2/3 hin are offered. Now, by the way, the 7 2/3 hin is still massive. It's still more than double what was offered on just a regular, like a Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah, all those things. And even those were massive compared to the regular daily libations. So this is, it's huge. I mean, yes, there's lots of animals being offered, but so much wine is being dumped out, right? You mentioned, what do you say, 1.5 gallons per hin?
Yeah, that's what I saw, yeah.
We got over 10 on that first day.
Yeah.
A lot of wine. So many gallons.
Yeah, and you have to wonder where it goes, but I have some thoughts on that in a little bit.
All right. It's not in anybody's mouths or livers, right?
Not in any human buddy's mouths. Yeah.
Ooh, all right. So I'm still, by the way, I don't know if anybody's ever paid attention ever to libation. Certainly not when reading sitting in shul and reading the Torah reading. I don't think anybody's ever paid attention to the massive quantities of wine being dumped out in the temple before. I'm still shocked by this. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's a lot of wine. It's a lot of wine. I mean, and also I think you mentioned this before. It's in the prayers, right? So in the Musaf prayers, for those who pray, you essentially give the formula. You say for an ox it's a half a hin, and for a ram it's a third of a hin, and for a sheep it's a quarter. And you just sort of give you sort of say the numbers. You don't do the math, but everyone says, everyone who's praying says it multiple times every holiday, and somehow it doesn't always process.
Yeah. So if we were to, you said 1.5 gallons per hin. So we're talking 15 to 20 hin on that first day of Sukkot. I'm sorry, 15 to 20 gallons.
Gallons, yeah. A lot.
That's like a full barrel. It's a full keg. It's like a keg of beer, but it's wine.
But it's wine, yeah.
Oof, that's really massive. Okay. All right. So then we move on. Sukkot is huge. There's one other little funny thing, which is in Numbers 28:7. It actually mentions shechar as part of the daily libations. Yet that's a weird contradiction to what we see in Numbers 15:5 is what's supposed to be offered, which is wine. But basically, all the libations in the Torah are wine.
Well, there's two different theories on how to understand that verse about the sheikhar, about the beer. So it either is fermented wine or old wine, because there's new wine, which more or less is grape juice, and then there's fermented wine, old wine. So that's one view that it means it's fermented, and maybe all the wine was fermented. Maybe it's not the exception; it's just giving more detail. The alternative explanation, which is based on the Akkadian offering of shikaru, which is sheikhar, the same word essentially, is that it actually is some form of non-wine beer, some fermented other drink. So there is that view. Some scholars have.
I mean, I don't know if obviously the rabbis take it in a different direction, but if it were to be beer, whether that's a date beer or barley or wheat beer, it could have been something where on the normal daily offerings it was supposed to be beer. Like beer is just a normal, regular, everyday drink. But when it comes to Shabbat, when it comes to holidays, those are special days, and wine is then to be offered. Right? It's an interesting, especially once you start thinking about the theological and not just like the experiential aspects. I mean, both are really cool. Like, beer's an everyday drink, but wine is for the special days.
Right, or for God, set aside for special offerings to God.
Then, if you think about the theological aspects, which is that God likes beer, but wine special. Right? And then, right. But then the rabbis take it in a different direction. They say, no, this is really, it needs to be wine that can intoxicate, that can be mishaker, which is it's a nice way of taking two conflicting texts and saying, well, we know it could be beer, but we're going to say it has to be wine that can intoxicate, rather than this fresh wine from the pressing vat.
Yeah, which again fits with the idea that it means fermented or old wine, right? That the rabbis fit very well with that scholarly understanding of the text.
Yeah, yain mishake, right? Yeah, for sure. All right. So speaking of rabbis, speaking of Chazal, so there are some questions that emerge just from reading the biblical text, which is how exactly is libation done, and where is it to be done? And sort of like it's like the where, the how. We haven't even discussed the why. So the rabbis discuss some of the mechanics of the placement, right?
Yeah, and just to lead into that, I think maybe the biggest innovation of that you see in the rabbinic text that you don't see in the Bible is this idea of nisucha mayim, of libation of water, that the rabbis say takes place on Sukkot. And along with all the wine, there's also a libation of water every day. And the rabbis say this isn't explicit in the Bible. It's something that's halacha Moshe Sinai. It's somehow there's a tradition going back to Sinai, and there's various hints in the text which we won't go into. But one of the things that means, Rabbi
Natan mentions it in a couple of places. Rabbi Natan, and then he says it's actually from that Numbers 28 verse about Shefar. He says, what does this mean? Like, what's this hasek nesech? Like, why the double language? That means both wine and water. And then
that's one derivation. Another one is there's like 3 extra letters that spell out mayim, that spell out water, or maybe unsacheha, it's libations in the plural, which can be rendered to say it's about wine and water. But these are hints. These are not, even the rabbis aren't saying that this is the straightforward meaning of the text. These are hints at an earlier tradition that the rabbis preserved. That's the rabbinic view.
Right. So there's nothing. So there's nothing in the biblical text. It's all about wine, maybe beer. And then the rabbis say, well, we're going to throw in water. We get that in the end of the 4th chapter of Sukkah, right, in the Mishnah.
Right. And one of the fascinating things that does is it means that and this is relevant to the question you were saying about where it goes, where you do the libation. The rabbis say that you do the libation, one view at least, we'll get into some detail, into different holes on the altar. And the rabbis say there are 2 holes, one for wine and one for water. And since it says actually, since wine is more viscous, is like thicker than water, the wine hole would be wider and the water hole would be narrower. That way, if you would pour wine and water, they'd go down the hole at the same pace, which is sort of interesting physics. You'd have to figure out how to do that, how to engineer that. But so that's one view, that the libations, the nisachim, are poured into a hole on the side of the altar. But really, there's a dispute about this. There's different views. Already, if you go back the idea of offering something on the altar, usually what that means when you offer something on the altar is it means you put it on the fire on top of the altar. Certainly for meat, that's the case. For flour offerings, that's the case.
You take the meat, you take the flour, and you put it on the fire.
Put it on the fire and it burns, and that's generally when you offer something up to God, what that means. And of course, there are parts that are eaten by people, by priests or the offerer. But if you're going to give it to God, usually that means you burn it, and then God receives the sweet smell, the reach nichoach. That's the standard thing. So, if you'd extrapolate from that, you'd say, okay, so you take the wine and pour it on the fire, and the fire will, make the wine evaporate, and that's your offering. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, which we already see as early as Ben Sira, which written around the first, second BCE or so. What?
2nd century BCE.
Yeah, 1st or 2nd century BCE, I believe, and there are different versions of it. So it's not, it was written and then preserved in different languages. But one passage it talks about pouring the wine in the temple by the base of the altar. So, and if you look in rabbinic literature, in the Sifra, the midrashic interpretation of Leviticus, there's a dispute there. It says, okay, you offer the libation as a reach nichoach, as a pleasing smell. So does that mean you pour it on the fire? And then it says, no, it doesn't mean you pour it on the fire. That would put out the fire. You can't do that. Instead, you pour it on the side of the altar and presumably into these holes. But that dispute, actually, in later texts, we still see this view that someone says, that you pour the water on top of the fire. That view is preserved later on. So it seems like it's rejected, but it does get a fair amount of play in rabbinic literature. So that's this big question. Are you pouring the wine on the fire, or are you pouring it on the side of the altar in these holes?
And later in rabbinic literature, they say, well, the fire is still going to be strong enough to still be burning.
Right. You should be able to get
a little bit of wine is not going to totally extinguish it. It's still going to be burning.
Presumably, right. If the fire is big enough, that wouldn't be a practical concern. But what I think is really interesting is what's at stake with these two models. You might say, okay, you pour it here, you pour it there. What difference does it make? But I think it's really part of a larger question that the rabbis have, which is what exactly is the role of this pleasing smell, this reach nichoach, that sacrifices are said to provide. If you look in the Bible, throughout, all sorts of offerings, the burnt offering, the peace offering, flour offerings, it says reach nichoach. It provides a sweet smell that one offers to God. And you could take that literally. You could say that means, God smells offerings. There's even the verse, but the story with Noah, it says God smelled the sweet smell of the offerings and said, I won't destroy the world again. So that's one understanding, which is very much focused on the fire. The fire is what's central. If you get to already in the Second Temple period, and certainly in rabbinic literature, there's a move away from the focus on the fire and certainly the smell. The smell is really secondary or not so important. What's more important is the pouring of the blood on the altar. And it's a whole different conception of how sacrifice works, but it's one that moves, without getting into too many details, it's one that moves away from the fire. So this idea of saying you don't pour the wine on the fire, you pour the wine on these holes on the altar, it's more like the blood that's poured on the side of the altar. It's a different sort of offering. You don't need God to smell it. You don't need the smell. That points, I think, that shift or that choice, interpretation of the rabbis, that it's on the side of the altar rather than on the fire, fits very well with their move away from reach nichoach, the pleasing smell.
So just thinking about it spatially, so you have the altar, and then running along the sides of the altar are the water and the wine tubes?
Yeah, on the side, but lower down, on the lower the altar. It's not really a cube shape. It's sort of a cube shape, but there's a ramp going up, and there's parts that are cut out the way the rabbis describe it. So one of the parts there's like a base, yesod, the base of the altar, which at least according to the rabbis is sort of stuck out a little bit all around. And in part of that, there's a couple of holes for libations.
Oh, so then they were kind of like drains.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that actually takes us to the next point, is how these drains exactly work. What exactly happens, right? So let's assume, as the mainstream view has it in rabbinic literature, that you take the wine or the water, but let's focus on the wine, and you pour it into this tube, into this tube of the altar. So there has to be, this is basic physics. If you just pour it in the hole, it's not going to disappear. Maybe a little bit can evaporate, can sink into the ground, but with the quantities that we're talking about, that would overflow very, very quickly. So what happens? What happens with the wine? And you'd think okay, the rabbis aren't practicing this. They could have said, whatever, there must have been some solution. No, the rabbis actually addressed this question head on. And there's two different views about it. One is that, describing these two holes, the Mishnah in Sukkah that you referenced before talks about them. It's like two nostrils, like two nostrils. That's very odd already, but fine. So the two views. One view is it goes down this hole all the way down to the depths, to Tehom. Tehom is this, the same way the world was created from the Tehom, and there are these creatures of the deep, basically, the deep, this out of this world essentially. They go all the way down to the deepest depths. The other view, the netherworld, exactly. But maybe it's a bit more complex than that. We'll get back to that in a second. The other view is that it would sort of pool. There was some underground room or something, some underground chamber where the wine would pool. And the Talmud says is every 70 years, they would go in there to that chamber, pull out this massive, I don't know what you want to call it, a grape snack, dried out wine from the last 70 years, because the water evaporates, right? You're just left with this thick wine thing, and fruit snacks, fruit snacks, and they take it out and then they burn it on the altar. Which, think about that. That's like a little mind bending, right? So the wine is not offered on the fire in this view; it's put in the holes. But 7 years later, you end up offering it a second time on the fire, right? So it's like a double offering almost. First it's poured, and then down the line it's burnt. But so it's very interesting. These two views are very, very fascinating. And what's at stake here? So first, I think this connects well to another dispute in the Talmud as to who built these tubes. Where do these tubes come from? And because the Mishnah says, or the Tosefta there says, it was created by the one who created it. That's the biggest cop-out you've ever seen, right? It was created by whoever created it. So there's two later interpretations. One says it was created by the one who created it, meaning the creator of the earth, by God. God created these tubes on the altar that would then take the wine. And that view, I think, fits very well with the view that they go down all the way to Tehom, to the netherworld, right? Because God can bridge between the physical world to the netherworld. God created both of them. So that's some supernatural creation. The altar is the supernatural entity. The other view is that it was created either by David or by King Solomon. There's different textual variants. But one of those early kings who built the temple or pre-built the temple built these tubes or had their people build these tubes. That's a much more naturalistic account of these tubes. There's two different theories of how we understand, how the rabbis understand the altar. And I think what's so fascinating is the altar is referred to as indirectly as God's nose. So the verse says, "Yasimu kitara be'apecha v'chalil al mizbechecha." You place smoke in your nose and a burnt offering on your altar. So in a way, one could think about the altar as God's nose, because you burn things on it and God smells it, so to speak, whatever that means. And so the altar is God's nose. And then you think about the fact that the two holes are referred to as two nostrils, chotamim, and maybe this is the metaphor that the rabbis are using. Maybe it's more than a metaphor. I think that's a theological question rather than a historical question. But this idea that you pour wine into these two holes, they're called nostrils. They were created by God, and they go all the way down to some out of this world place. It sounds very much like at least a metaphor of you are feeding God the wine directly into God's nostrils, which really is like a fascinating, mind-bending idea. So yeah, that's part of what's at stake there, I think, with the question of how to libate the wine, where it goes, why one's doing it, and that ties into the question of, is God actually consuming the offerings, right? Is God actually smelling the burnt offering? Is God actually drinking, so to speak, the wine? Some views fit better with a more literal take, and some fit better with a more metaphorical or non-literal take.
Really? Well, I imagine with the more sort of like literal would be like, well, God's drinking, he's eating, and the more he eats, the more he's going to drink. It's just going to be corresponding. Well,
right.
So what I get the literal. What would be the metaphorical?
So the metaphorical view, and really this goes back to the big dispute even in the Bible about how to understand burnt offerings and how to understand all offerings. There's only the only case where it says God actually smells the smoke is with Noah. It doesn't say anywhere else that God actually smells it. It says that it's a reach nichoach l'Hashem. It's a burnt offering to God, meaning like it's presented to God. But the verses don't explicitly say God smells it. And in fact, If you look in Psalms, I think Psalms 50, although it depends on how you're counting, the different chapter counts, where it says, do I need this meat? Do I need this food? I'm not hungry. So there's an explicit polemic against this idea that God consumes food, which of course was the mainstream ancient Near Eastern view, that God consumes these offerings. So for the Bible overall, there's a lot of tension, really. There's different emphases in different places. And so if you don't think God is literally eating the food, then the symbolism is humans are offering food to God. God, of course, is supernatural, beyond physical needs, doesn't need to eat it. But there's this idea of offering gifts, even if the gifts aren't necessary, right? And I think, contemporary theologians have similar ideas. God is beyond any need. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things for God, right? And it's a way of showing our allegiance, or showing that we want to do something for God, even if it's impossible. So that's, I think, that both the current theology many have, but also it fits very well with many classical cultures, including arguably the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic literature.
Has anybody try to contemporize it, or sort of like take it and say, like, that's for God, and then for us as an act of imitatio Dei, trying to imitate God, that for us it's it's nice to eat and drink on a regular basis, but when it comes to these special days, whether it's Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah, etc., we should eat more, we should drink more, and then on Sukkot, really eat and drink more. Does anybody try to take that
in that direction? I haven't seen in that direction, but the idea of imitatio Dei, of imitating God. So Jonathan Klawans has a book about sacrifice that I found very instructive. One of the things he says, he has a theory that part of the idea of sacrifice, of humans killing animals and doing various other rituals, is to imitate God. God has the capacity to kill or to give life, and people imitate God in that way. So I don't know if he would agree with your suggestion or not. It's an interesting idea. If anything, you might say the opposite, right? God is being offered more food, so we should imitate God by being offered more. I thought the way you were saying it was, whatever we're doing, we should sort of give similarly to God. I don't know what comes first or what comes second.
We correspond that just as God is eating and drinking more in those days,
we should more on those days. Okay, yeah. So I don't know what he would say about that theory, but it might fit. It's an interesting idea.
Rabbi Dr. Zuckier, thank you so much for joining us. I super duper appreciate your wisdom and insights on this episode.
Thank you. This was really great.
Awesome. L'chaim.
L'chaim.